Welcome to today's webinar, The End of Working Poverty, Effective Public Policy. My name is Paul Bourne, the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute and founder of Vibrant Communities. I'm here to introduce our discussion today with Jeff Loomis of Momentum, Jeff Stapleton of Open Policy Ontario, and Garima Talwar Kapoor of Maytree. Welcome to the three of you.
Thank you.
What we know is that if we're going to end working poverty, we're going to need to work at it from a variety of angles. On the one hand, we need to work with employers to get them to pay better wages, and not just wages, to have better working conditions. We know that we need to work at preparing workers for good jobs so that they're able to work at a level that this pay is warranted and these jobs are there. And that requires our education system and beyond to prepare workers for the workforce. How does one actually even think about developing policies to end poverty?
Thanks very much, Paul. I think I want to make a distinction first between the advisory committee to Minister Duclos that ended actually with the publication of Opportunity for All last August, and then resulted in a bill called C-87, the Poverty Reduction Act, which has now been taken over to something called Bill C-97, which is the Budget Implementation Act. So it's now all part of this omnibus bill, and that omnibus bill also creates the new advisory council to the Minister of Families and Economic and Social Development, and so I've applied to be on that too. So we'll see how far that goes. But I think what we were really trying to do was look at poverty on all fronts. We were often fond of saying that we use a swimming pool analogy for poverty reduction, because we talk about people being in the shallow end and other people being in the deep end. And I think it's important to say that most of our seniors who are living in poverty are in shallow poverty, because we have OAS, GIS, we have other tax credits, etc. And people who are receiving on social assistance, who are about 40% of the poor across Canada, are what we, in most cases, in what we would call deep poverty. So when we talk about the working poor, we're talking about people who are both in the deep end and the shallow end. So some people would, with a minimum wage, like in Ontario at $14 an hour, if you've got full-time wages, you're at $27,000 and you're about $5,000 out of poverty. But as we all know, people who are in those type of jobs, the service entry jobs, are the last hired, first fired. They don't have the hours, they don't have the tenure, maybe not being eligible for employment insurance. So really, as part of the advisory committee, we were working on all cylinders in terms of making sure that we have programs in place. Some that come to mind are like the employment insurance working on claim, making sure that the transformed working income tax benefit, now called the Canada's Workers Benefit, which is now subject to auto enrollment as long as you file your income taxes. All these things start to become a suite of programs on the income security side that allow people who are in the working poor population actually to receive assistance from government, generally speaking, while they're working. So it's in-work benefits as opposed to the much larger suite of programs that pay people after they've worked, like EI, CPP, workers' comp, veterans benefits, workplace benefits, etc. So it's really important that we make this shift to providing assistance to people while they're working. And of course, Canada's Child Benefit has greatly helped with that also. So that's the sort of things that we were working on with the advisory committee, and to be able to take that first step in reducing poverty by 20% by 2020, which the government has already announced that it's achieved.
I think I've been at this all my life, and I actually now understand this suite of programs, particularly the kind of programs that are available for people before they work, for people who lose their jobs. But this is a really interesting one about assistance while they're working. And we haven't even implemented the worker benefit, right? Talk to me about that. Like, how is that good? Is that a game changer?
It can be. It's still relatively a small program, even with the extra money that they're putting into it. And in some ways, the even more important aspect of auto enrollment, because we had a lot of people with very poor working poverty that weren't eligible for it. But when you have a program that's a major program delivered through this tax system, and hopefully we'll be able to get that program to be a monthly program. It will start to act in very much the same way as the Canada Child Benefit, or a program like GIS to get seniors out of poverty, because it's paid in a timely and regular way so that people can rely on it. Most people getting a tax refund, that's their only way to save. But if we can change the refundable credit system in such a way as it provides reliable income, and we've already done that with child benefits, and as of 2014, we have a much more regular GST credit mechanism. And also with aspects of the Canada Workers Benefit that were tried out during the Whitby years of that's the working income tax benefit to pay advance payments. All of this comes together in a way that if you have people who are in the working population but are still, for a single, for example, is under 22,000, which is roughly where the LIM or the NBM put poverty for a single person. We know people are working at 15, 16, 17, 18,000. The other point that I'd make is that in some ways, we've lopsidedly helped families with children and seniors. And where we were really seeing the growth of poverty is amongst the single people. And we know that singles form are growing in terms of the single person household. And so it's going to be really important that we are able to use the income security system in such a way as we do that. Our main challenge is that in many ways, the programs that we have for people while they're in work are like three cats in a bag. They don't. The social assistance has one complete set of rules and asset testing and other things. And then we have EI working on claim, which is quite a different animal again, because you have to meet all the EI regular rules, which are quite difficult to obtain at the same time as you receive limited time benefits that are time limited, unlike social assistance or the Canada Workers Benefit. So I'd like to see some convergence over time in these programs so that they form a seamless suite of programs for people in working poverty.
You've been at this all your life. What advice are you going to give the minister to end working poverty in Canada beyond what's already been done?
What I think we really need to work on now is the social assistance side of this, because, and even though it's of course arguable, and of course the case that the provinces are responsible for social assistance, I think what we need to start thinking about is a larger refundable credit, which of course would be exempt from social assistance, to be paid out by the federal government, maybe in concert with provinces and the federal government. In many, I'm fond of saying that we have a guaranteed annual income in Canada. It's just very, very small. It's just formed by the GST credit and some of the other provincial credits. So we do need something put right at the very bottom, because we know that in the world of real politics in Canada, if you start asking for a major increase in social assistance, like a 15 or 20% increase that would only take people up to half the poverty line in the first place, there's going to be a great deal of resistance to it. There's much less resistance to the idea of generally available benefits that we provide to people. And even though more expensive, they're more politically palatable. We also need to think about, we also need to think about the fact that as minimum wages have gone up, we know in Canada that 30% of our cashiers have university degrees, and therefore the people who are on social assistance receiving, $9,000-10,000 a year are looking at minimum wage jobs that are paying $27,000. So what's not to like? And we have a system now that's awash with financial incentives for people to take those jobs. But if they're facing the barriers that singles often face in terms of numeracy, literacy, addiction, etc., education deficits, they're not going to be able to take those jobs. So just raising minimum wage on its own is not going to get people who are very marginalized into those jobs.
Very good. John, thanks. We're going to come back to you. Going to do a little interview with Jeff and Garima, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So if you do have a question as you're listening to any of the panelists, just put it into your chat box, and Natasha will pick those up and send them on our way, and we'll go from there. Jeff, I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that you're doing at Momentum. And I've been to your offices. I see the work that you do. I don't think you guys are radical by any means, but you fight for the worker and for people living in poverty, and you try to get them back into jobs, and you've got a variety of ways of doing that. By helping them either start their small businesses, save money, find work, that whole gamut. And you're an amazing organization, and thanks for dedicating so much of your life to all of this. Jeff, I know that one of the things that your organization has always been passionate about is, what has been nicknamed as predatory lending, right? Which affects people who are working, who are poor, particularly working because they take your next paycheck. Essentially, is what you're giving them when they're lending you money. So maybe just start with I'm a worker, I'm unemployed, or I'm employed, and the world just isn't fair, right? And Momentum shows up and says, how do we make this world a little more fair for you?
Yeah.
Give us a sense of your work and how you do this and kind of how it relates to policy.
Yeah, well, our work, as you said, is grounded in working with people living on low incomes, and the vast majority of the people we work with, the 3,000 Calgarians a year, are working, and they're just working in lower wage jobs. And so all of our work is grounded in, attempts to be grounded in that experience. And as you mentioned, we work with people to get better jobs through employment training, or work with people to create their own job through business, or supplement their income through business, or to manage and save money. And so our interest in policy work and trying to move the needle in fairness is based on, to a large degree, what our participants experience. And so we're really moved by to try to create that change at scale. That's where policy becomes critical from a community organization standpoint. And I think there's a fantastic article that was in The Philanthropist on the moral imperative for charities to engage in policy work. And that really resonates with our approach of why do we need to address policy change. So when it comes to an issue like payday lending or other forms of high cost credit, the reason we got interested in that issue and trying to have influence is because we were working with people to manage and ultimately try to save their money, and they were getting stuck in debt traps. And it's a very expensive loan product. We don't use the word predatory because it's it's an inflammatory term, so we often use more like fringe financial. But we had the experience hearing from participants that they were having to pay in Alberta before the policy change. It was up to 600% annual interest rates. We had Alberta was the most expensive province in the entire country to get a payday loan until the policy change happened a few years ago. And so it makes it very difficult for someone to be able to actually move forward, because we believe in a quote that without income you can't get by, but without assets or savings you can't get ahead. So that's where we felt, okay, if we're having participants experience this, I would say fairly significant unfairness, that people that can least afford credit were having to pay the most to borrow money, how could we have influence? And so with a number of community partners, we've started advocating for policy change, originally for payday lending. And we were successful on that at the municipal level, and then more importantly at the provincial level. That's where the real jurisdiction lies for fringe financial products in our country. And so our province made some pretty bold change, and it had a huge impact on the industry here in Alberta. And we went from the most expensive province to the most affordable province to get a payday loan. And then just earlier this year, the province announced new regulations on other forms of high cost credit, things like rent to own, which can be just as bad as payday loans from an unfairness standpoint. They just don't get quite as much public attention at times as payday loans do.
Jeff, you're just you're proof of that article. You know that in many ways, who would have thought that there'd be someone fighting like that at your level for the worker, right? And particularly that you could live out this vision of without income you cannot get by, and without assets you can't get ahead. And this understanding that we need to advocate to create an environment where having assets and savings and moving people forward is easy to do. It's fascinating. I'm wondering a little bit about if you could tell us a little bit more about your assets program at Momentum, and how do you kind of support people in saving money and getting ahead?
Yeah,
and I assume many of these are low-income workers.
Yeah, and we're now using the term more often of financial empowerment, because we really believe that people need to not just learn about money. That's not going to really reduce poverty when it's just financial literacy, but actually create the opportunities for people to build their savings and then increase that financial asset base. So the primary tool that we use is match savings. Whereas people are learning about money, they're able to earn a match that then goes towards a savings goal of their choice. And so over the years of operating those programs, we've now provided over $4 million in matched savings. And then we also work really hard to promote government-backed, essentially matched savings programs. So we've worked really hard in Calgary to increase the uptake of the Canada Learning Bond. So, which is for lower income families, lots of people that are working to be able to save money for their child's education in a registered education savings plan. Nice. So over the last years, we've seen the Canada Learning Bond uptake go from under 20% in Calgary, it was 18%, and now it's at 46%, which is one of the leading uptake levels of cities in Canada. But there's always policy challenges, like one that we learned from participants in working with them to open up RSPs. We found out that people could not be eligible for public housing in Calgary if they had an RSP. It counted as an asset and would make them ineligible to get into public housing. So we heard that from participants, and then we advocated to the province, because the rules for public housing, social housing were set at the provincial level. And a number of years ago, the province exempted RSPs as an asset for eligibility for social housing. So that was really critical, and somewhat similarly, the province just in the last few months increased the asset limits for income support and disability benefits. So not trying to exclude people from accessing forms of social assistance just because they have savings, and not penalizing people for having those, what are still oftentimes quite small savings.
That's amazing work, Jeff. We're going to move next to Garima. Just first of all, Maitri has taken on a human rights lens around poverty reduction. It's highly welcomed by us and by many others. It was a vacant space, I feel, in the poverty discussion. Can you just talk to me about that a little bit? Just about what's your approach? Why take on a human rights lens, and maybe even why is this important for the working poor?
Sure. So I think that first off, many people can get nervous, especially in the policy space, around the idea of using human rights as a frame to talk about poverty alleviation. And I think that when you step back, a key question that we ask ourselves is, what are the basic dignities that we think all Canadians should be afforded?
Okay.
And when you ask that question, and you step back and you think about what is happening in our economy and labor market and the impacts of that on our broader social fabric, you start to realize that a human rights approach can actually be beneficial to repairing some of that social fabric. And so to make it a bit more tangible, I think that in the past, in human rights discourse, especially in Canada, the focus has been much on civil and political rights. So people have the right not to be discriminated against for their race or gender or sexual orientation, disability, amongst a number of other areas of discrimination. We have the right to vote. However, what we also understand is that the way people exercise those rights is interrelated to somebody's social location. And it may be that if you are poor, you are unable to appropriately find safe and adequate housing, or you are unable to access the resources that you need so that you can lead so that you can access healthcare. And so from our perspective, I think the question around what is the value of a human rights lens when we discuss poverty and poverty alleviation policy proposals, it's important to ask ourselves where we are now and where we see ourselves going as a nation. And with an increase in precarity in the labor market, with increasing income inequalities that mirror increasing skills inequalities and increasing health inequalities, it's important to ask ourselves, again, the question, what do we think all Canadians, by virtue of being a human being, deserve to have? And I think there is general consensus that things like housing is something that in general discourse, people would agree that people have the right to housing. But then the question becomes, how do you implement that? And as we're seeing through the Budget Implementation Act, just like the Poverty Reduction Act, the National Housing Strategy Act was also introduced as part of the Budget Implementation Act. And what the NHS Act does is it starts to legislate the right to housing in Canada. And for us and for our partners, that is a huge move from where we were a couple of years ago. It's in recognition of the housing crisis that we're experiencing right now in almost all parts of Canada, and that there is not only it's not just the government's responsibility, but it is our broader public responsibility to ensure that people are taken care of.
Thanks to all three of you. You're an inspiration. Thank you, not just for being on this webinar, but for the work that you do in your everyday lives.